In the early 1800s, no tribe on America's northern plains was as feared as the Blackfoot. The mere mention of their name sent shivers down the spines of mountain men and rival tribes alike. Tonight, join history at the OK Corral as we examine some of the deadliest battles in the proud history of the Blackfoot.
Alberta, Canada, October 25, 1870. Just as the sun crests the horizon on another chilly autumn morning, two young families in a small camp near the Belly River are just beginning to wake. Suddenly, the still morning air is broken by the horrifying sound of muffled, hurried footsteps approaching the two lodges. For a sickening few seconds, this sends a collective chill down the spines of the young fathers, mothers, and children ensconced inside their warm buffalo hide lodges. Scarcely a few moments later, the blinding light of the morning sun pours into the family's lodges as the walls of their teepees are slit open by the attacking Cree warriors, the longtime bitter enemy of the Blackfoot, who swarm into the family's shelters, swiftly dispatching every unfortunate Blackfoot inside, regardless of age or gender. The unfortunate victims are scarcely able to utter a sound before their lives are mercilessly snuffed out at the end of Cree war clubs, knives, and lances. However chaotic, ruthless, and bloody this scene may be, it is seen by the attacking Cree warriors as just retribution. Many among the young warriors are alight with pride and glee. However, several among the attacking party now begin to grow more and more weary about a premonition shared by one of their most respected chiefs less than 24 hours ago. The day prior, the Cree war party had gathered in the middle of the Albertan plains, with several dozen warriors standing in a semicircle around the revered Cree war chief Piapo. Chief Piapo had had a dream, and the dream had given him great concern about proceeding. As the impatient party of young warriors stood skeptically listening to his recounting of the dream, he beseeched them to proceed no further on this raid. He proclaimed that he had seen a giant buffalo with iron horns, and that this buffalo was attacking the entire camp, mauling and killing them wholesale. Piapo is now greatly concerned. But while dreams and visions do indeed hold great sway within the Cree tribe, this does not mean that all visions are created equal, nor that all are to be taken seriously. This party of bellicose young men, regardless of their respect for a veteran war chief, had remained resolutely intent on exacting their revenge for horses stolen and family members killed. The Cree now move on to another group of Blackfoot camped near the river who are all asleep in their teepees in assumed safety. Several Cree warriors stealthily slip within arrow range downwind of these lodges and ruthlessly dispatch the few pet dogs who themselves are just beginning to wake in the morning light. Yet another horrific scene begins to unfold as the Cree descend upon the small encampment. Believing this to be the main Blackfoot contingent, no effort is made to conceal their arrival, nor to muffle their weaponry. Within seconds, the air is filled with the sounds of war cries, gun smoke, and rifle fire. These lodges of the Blackfoot are again slit open, and again the inhabitants within are ruthlessly cut down. But this time, several Blackfoot manage to flee towards the river. Several are shot down, but more manage to escape over the low rolling hills. As the Cree move on to complete the grim task of finishing off any wounded Blackfoot and looting the camp of any valuables, they pay little consideration to the Blackfoot who have managed to get away. Here on the open prairie, in the freezing cold, they assume the survivors, having fled without blankets or weapons, will ultimately die from exposure to the elements. But the Cree are wrong. These small encampments of Blackfoot families are, in fact, only outliers of a massive Blackfoot village, hundreds of warriors strong, who have now been alerted to the Cree's actions, and are now themselves on the warpath for revenge. This camp represents a coalition of bands known as the Blackfoot Confederacy, made up of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Northern and Southern Piegan, and, added recently at this point in the 1870s, the Sarsi and Gros Ventre. The most powerful tribe here on the northern plains, the Blackfoot have long dominated the area, and in doing so, have developed a long-standing enmity with many neighboring tribes, none more so than the Cree. The Cree have also formed a conglomeration of bands known as the Iron Confederacy, comprised of the Plains Cree, the Woods Cree, the Saulteaux, the Assiniboine, the Métis, and the Haudenosaunee. They trace their tribal origins to the James Bay area between present-day Ontario and Quebec, on the southern tip of the Hudson Bay. With the incursion of the European fur trade in the 16th century, the Cree were pushed west onto the plains. It had seemed that conflict with the Blackfoot was all but unavoidable, and, to be sure, it had been. The rivalry between the Blackfoot and the Cree is one born, like many intertribal conflicts, out of a scarcity of land and resources. For centuries, the two peoples have conducted these raids against one another in the fight to secure hunting grounds, to uphold tribal honor, and to exact their retribution in what seems to be an inexorable cycle of violence and vengeance. The Blackfoot, being the larger tribe, had often gotten the better of these clashes, and now they will seek to bring to bear the full might of their forces in defending their village and in punishing their attackers. Back at the site of their second attack, as the Cree pour through the spoils of their raid, several among them suddenly stop, stand fully upright, and listen intently. Somewhere, not far beyond the ridges that line the Belly River, hoofbeats are rapidly approaching their position. The cry suddenly goes out amongst the victorious Cree that more Blackfoot are now on the way. From where, they do not know, but every man among them now scrambles to his weapons and makes ready to fight. In mere minutes, the small river valley is suddenly flooded with hundreds of horse-bound Blackfoot warriors, all descending upon the Cree position at full speed. The Cree, now suddenly on the defensive, take whatever cover they can in the bottom of the valley near the river, and then hunker down in order to make a desperate bid for their own lives. For hours, a vicious close-quarters fight unfolds, as the Blackfoot seek to ensure that not a single transgressing Cree warrior survives. Time and again, Blackfoot warriors charge the Cree position, pouring arrows and bullets in among them, killing dozens. Finally, with all hope seemingly lost, many of the Cree attempt to swim across the Belly River to at least put the body of water between themselves and their attackers. But these warriors are quickly spotted by a half-blooded Blackfoot scout named Jerry Potts. Potts had been born in 1840 inside Montana's Fort McKenzie, the only son of a Cree mother and a Scottish fur trader father. After his father's death when he was still a young boy, his mother had rejoined the Cree and given custody of the young Potts to Alexander Harvey of the American Fur Company. Sadly, Harvey had turned out to be a cruel caretaker, eventually abandoning Potts in 1845. Later that same year, Potts had been adopted by a kindly fur trapper, also from the American Fur Company, a man named Andrew Dawson. After spending his formative years under Dawson's care, Potts would eventually rejoin his mother with the Cree tribe. Here, he would complete all of their rites of passage, becoming a full-fledged member of the tribe, though he still preferred to clothe himself in mostly European garb. However, Potts had gone on to marry 2 Blackfoot women and had many children within the tribe. By 1870, he had been made a chief in the Kainai Band and had amassed a considerable fortune as well as a respected reputation during his time with the tribe. Potts now alerts his Blackfoot comrades to the attempted escape, and he and the rest of the Blackfoot warriors descend upon the Cree in the river like a pack of wolves upon a wounded bison. Now, much like the unfortunate Blackfoot whom the Cree had killed while they attempted to slog their way through the river to safety, the Cree themselves are now slaughtered wholesale along the banks of the river. In his later account of the battle, Potts recalled the Cree being so thickly gathered upon the riverbanks that one could, quote, close their eyes and pull the trigger and still manage to dispatch them one by one. Only a few dozen Cree, out of the 100-strong attacking force, managed to escape the charnel house of the steep river banks, now fleeing onto the expanses of the open Albertan prairie. A large force of Blackfoot, loath to let any of their aggressors escape, now immediately take to pursuing the remaining Cree, who are making their way in a dead sprint towards a sparse, small thicket of brush. The majority of these warriors are cut down before reaching the relative cover of the thicket. As their comrades fall to the left and to the right of them, the few surviving Cree who managed to make it to the thicket now hunker down as the horrifying spectacle of a cyclonic Blackfoot attack seemingly engulfs them from all angles. Finally, though, seeing that there are so few Cree left, the Blackfoot eventually take their leave, heading back to their grieving village and to the bodies of the vanquished. They stop at the corpse of each freshly slain Cree in order to claim their rightful trophies of war in the way of usable goods, trinkets, and scalps. The bodies are then summarily and thoroughly mutilated in order to further punish their attackers. Back at the river, the water now runs red with the blood of both Cree and Blackfoot, an immediate, visceral reminder of the horrors that have just occurred. The stench of death permeates the small valley, and the cries of grieving Blackfoot women fill the air. Though confrontations like this one have gone on for decades, if not centuries, between the tribes of the Canadian Plains, this fight, known to history as the Battle of Belly River, will go down in history as the largest and the last intertribal battle in Canadian history. In 1871, the year following the battle, a treaty will be struck between the Blackfoot and the Cree, officially ending the ongoing war between the two tribes. The tribes of the Northern Plains lived in an unforgiving reality, where resources were finite and territory was everything. And thus, as is universally the case with the human condition, conflicts inevitably arose. But the many tales of the hundreds, if not thousands of intertribal battles that occurred on the Great Plains of North America are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Montana, 1836. In the middle of the night, in the dead of winter, a young fur trapper named Isaac P. Rose shakes himself free from the warmth of the buffalo robe he has been sleeping in and rises to his feet. In a daze, the man wanders into the freezing, ominous darkness of the woods that surround his and his companion's small campsite. He trudges to a spot a few dozen yards away, feeling inextricably drawn to a small clearing just beyond the tree line. As he comes into view of the clearing, he is shocked to see the hulking figure of a lone grizzly bear. For the veteran mountain man, the sight of a grizzly bear here in the wilds near Clark's Fork on the Yellowstone River is not at all unusual. However, this grizzly is standing on his hind legs, nearly 8 feet tall, and staring intently at the bewildered man. Locking eyes with Rose, the bear walks up to the man, striding in an eerily human-like gait, and speaks. He tells Rose, in a deep, steady voice, to shake his hand. Rose, more confused than afraid, offers the hulking beast his left hand. The bear refuses to take it. Rose, sensing the animal's offense, hurriedly extends his right hand instead. At this, the bear silently and solemnly shakes the man's hand with both of his massive paws. Then, the bear suddenly disappears with a gust of icy wind. Just as suddenly, Rose finds himself awakened by the morning sun, still wrapped in the warm buffalo blanket. It had all, of course, been a dream. Rose and his fellow mountain men, a party composed of himself, as well as Joe Meek, Jack Larison, and Mark Heed, have departed from their main company to procure meat for their starving comrades. The main party, under the leadership of the legendary mountain man Jim Bridger, are camped 30 miles away. They are counting on Rose and their other comrades to ease the troublesome burden of surviving the harsh winter at hand. They have thus far been successful, as they have managed to kill so many buffalo that, after one day's hunt, 4 of the 8 horses that had been brought along to pack the meat now find themselves burdened by full loads. The snow is deep, and travel has been slow. With another long, cold day ahead of them, the 4 trappers begin to pack their things and make ready for travel. As they do this, Rose recounts his strange dream to his companions, partly for their amusement, and partly hoping one of them might proffer an explanation as to the meaning of it. He tells them how Caleb, the colloquial name amongst the mountain men for the grizzly bear, had come to him in a dream, that he had spoken and only shaken his right hand. Joe Meek, another veteran trapper, shakes his head and lowers his concerned eyes on Rose. "You better look out, Rose, or you'll shake hands with Beelzebub before night." While the grizzly bear certainly instills a healthy sense of respect and fear in any mountain man, what they fear most is coming into contact with Beelzebub. Though this name is used in the New Testament for the devil, that is not the image that comes to the typical trapper's mind when they hear the word. For these men, the most fearful entity that they might encounter here in the wilds, thousands of miles from their places of birth, is not the grizzly, nor is it the venomous snakes, nor buffalo stampedes, wolves, mountain lions, flash floods, avalanches, or wildfires. For the mountain men, their greatest fear is the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot, or Siksika, had originated in the northeast, near the area between modern-day Maine and Canada. They would eventually make their way to the Great Lakes region, and then, even further west, to the expanses of the plains of present-day Alberta, Canada, and the state of Montana. They had subsisted in these unforgiving environs for centuries as foot-bound hunters. Before the introduction of the horse into the Blackfoot culture in the 18th century, they had survived by chasing buffalo herds off of cliffs, gathering at the bottom to butcher the animals. Their cultural transformation to a horse-based people who hunted, conducted warfare, and traveled on horseback was delayed far longer than tribes further south. This was due more to geography than anything else, as the Blackfoot's northerly location placed them farther away from the large populations of horses found in Mexico and Texas. But, however forestalled their transformation might have been, it had also been incredibly rapid and incredibly consequential on the northern plains. The Blackfoot had quickly mastered hunting and fighting from atop charging mounts and had proven the most formidable power in the area for decades by the time Isaac Rose and his comrades ventured into their territory in the 1830s. During the winter months, which can often amount to more than half the year in these northernmost reaches of the Great Plains, the Blackfoot set up their villages in wooded river valleys. On the rare occasion that they venture out from these quarters, it is generally to partake in the same practice as Rose and his companions. They hunt the buffalo herds that hunker down in wooded areas and harvest as many as they can carry back in order to sustain their families and community until the long-awaited end of winter. For their part, the buffalo are more than simply a main food source of the Blackfoot. For the Blackfoot, nearly every tool and furnishing at their disposal comes, in some form or fashion, from the buffalo. Properly known as the American bison or plains bison, they are the largest animal on the North American continent. The largest males can weigh upwards of 2,000 pounds and be incredibly unpredictable. They roam virtually the entirety of the middle of the continent, from northern Canada to Mexico, in what is known as the Bison Belt. At their peak, most experts estimate their population to range from 30 to 50 million, with some estimates being as high as 75 million. Their thick hides provide the material with which the Blackfoot and other plains tribes construct their teepees. Their bones, hooves, and horns are used to construct tools and cooking utensils. Bison meat is, of course, the basis of the Blackfoot diet. Roasted, fried, boiled, dried, or raw, it can be prepared and consumed in a variety of manners. To the Blackfoot, the buffalo are a sacred gift from their creator, one meant to sustain their way of life and livelihood. As such, they see fit to protect their resources by any means necessary. Since the buffalo herds are such an important resource for the Blackfoot, any incursion into their territory and especially any hunting of the buffalo on that territory, is seen as an offense punishable by death. Hugh Monroe, a Canadian fur trapper who was adopted into the Blackfoot, gives his account of how viciously the Blackfoot dealt with intruders, even of other native tribes. After finding a still smoldering campfire of a neighboring tribe referred to as the River People, the Blackfoot whom Monroe was living with became inconsolably irate and set on revenge. He asked one warrior, a man named Lone Walker, what had happened. Monroe's account is as follows. "The campers here were river people," said Lone Walker. "We have forbidden them to come over here to our plains, but they keep coming and stealing our buffaloes. We shall now make them cry." "You are going to fight them?" asked Monroe. "Yes," said Lone Walker. "I shivered," recalls Monroe. "In my mind's eye, I saw a great battle of arrows flying and guns booming, and men falling and crying out in their death and agony. And for what? Just a few buffalo that blackened the plains?" "Don't fight," pleaded Monroe. "There are plenty of buffaloes. Let the river people go in peace with what they have killed." "But," the Canadian recalled, "he gave me no answer other than a grim smile, and rode out to meet the head of the Blackfoot column. In the ensuing fight, the Blackfoot would kill 7 of the river people's warriors, as their women and children fled in a desperate panic. All 7 dead warriors would be scalped and otherwise mutilated, as equal parts punishment and warning. Afterwards, a great celebration was held. In their present circumstances, Rose and his fellow trappers are, of course, well aware of the danger their venture has placed them in. However, they are also aware that the buffalo meat they return to their company with could quite literally be the difference between a relatively comfortable winter and possibly starving to death in the middle of nowhere. And so now, for the time being, they are not dissuaded from their job at hand. The 4 men plan to continue on with their day, spending it much the same as they had the day before. Rose, the most reliable shot, would fall a buffalo, and then they would all set into quartering and packing the meat. However, after seeing several hundred of the animals, they have proven so unusually skittish that Rose cannot get close enough to get off a shot. This suspicious behavior spells only one sure thing, according to the veteran mountain man's instincts, that the Blackfoot are nearby. The trappers agree that their best course of action is to return to the camp with the buffalo meat they have been able to procure so far. They head southeast through rolling hills. As the men ride, conversation is kept to a minimum, and their eyes continually scan the landscape around them. They all know that being caught with a bounty of buffalo meat will likely spell a torturous end at the hands of the Blackfoot. This end could certainly come via a variety of tortures routinely employed by almost all Plains tribes. These included being staked out in the summer sun, burned under red-hot coals, or quite literally being carved to pieces as their torturers, along with the women and children of the tribe, laugh at and chide them. But a hard death could also, as Rose and company had found out only weeks earlier, be suffered even after escaping a Blackfoot attack. A Delaware tribesman named Manhead, who had been traveling with the fur company, had been out hunting with Rose when the pair were suddenly attacked by a small group of Blackfoot warriors. Rose and Manhead had managed to make it back to camp, with Manhead suffering only a flesh wound from a bullet in his calf. But as soon as they reached camp, Manhead informed Rose that he had been hit with a dreaded poison bullet, and his demise was all but certain. Over the succeeding hours, the unfortunate Delaware would suffer an agonizing death. In his biographical work on Isaac Rose titled 4 Years in the Rockies, author James B. Marsh addresses the reader directly in how these poison bullets were made. Perhaps our readers may not be fully aware of the method resorted to by the Indians to poison their bullets. It is done this way. A small piece of buffalo meat is placed on the end of a forked stick, and a rattlesnake is induced to strike it with his fangs. This poisoned meat is then dried, pounded into a powder, and placed in a small bag. When the Indian intends to use one of these poisoned bullets, he first puts it in his mouth and chews it for some time. Then dips it into the bag, and the slightest wound from one of these bullets can cause death. As the trappers try to push these fears from their mind and focus on the task at hand, they feel an inexorable tension as the undulating terrain provides ample cover for a Blackfoot ambush. All they can hope for now is to make it back to their company's main camp and the comparative safety in numbers it provides. But after a few long hours of riding, it appears to the trappers as though they might actually make it to their destination unscathed. Then, just as they are about to reach a small ravine, a party of 8 Blackfoot spring up, screaming their defiant, powerful war cries. The lead Blackfoot warrior is scarcely 10 feet from Rose when the attack begins. Rose, in the lead, wheels his horse and is now the closest target for the Blackfoot to attack. Almost as suddenly as he can turn his horse to flee, the air is filled with the roar of gunfire, and Blackfoot musket balls whiz all around him. One of the balls passes through his cap, while another rips across his chest, leaving a jagged but shallow cut across his skin and cutting the strings of his shot pouch, causing the critical piece of weaponry to fall to the ground. Another ball passes through the wrist of his buckskin glove, again miraculously only causing minor superficial damage to the wrist. Rose's most grievous wound comes when one of the lead balls smashes into his right elbow. The ball enters just above the joint and exits through the forearm, rendering the limb all but useless for the time being. The Blackfoot warrior nearest Rose, seeing he is now incapacitated, rides forward to finish the attack. The warrior attempts to grab Rose's horse by its bridle with one hand while attempting to shove Rose from the animal. Rose uses his severely injured right hand to hang on to the reins, while he repeatedly strikes the Blackfoot warrior in the face with his riding whip. As he does this, Rose's horse panics and lurches away from the Blackfoot, taking off in a dead run in the direction of the other trappers. This is a fortuitous break for the mountain man. However, as the horse wheels around to make their escape, Rose's rifle falls from his lap. He now realizes he is severely wounded and without any means of defense save for his hunting knife and tomahawk. His only remaining hope now is to hang on for dear life as his horse makes a mad dash away from the Blackfoot. Gritting his teeth, Rose urges the animal onward, doing all he can to hang on to the reins with his one working arm. Looking behind him, he sees the Blackfoot warrior closest in pursuit stop to pick up Rose's valuable rifle from the ground, fumbling with the rifle's leather scabbard. Rose again turns his gaze forward, hunkered down as low as possible next to his horse's neck. He then hears a sound he is well familiar with, the crack of his own rifle, followed by the sound of yet another musket ball whizzing by his head. Rose's charging steed manages to catch up to the party of 3 other trappers, whose retreat has been slowed by their heavily burdened pack animals. Seeing no better option, Jack Larison cuts the straps holding the loads to the animals, leaving hundreds of pounds of meat spilled upon the rolling prairie. Larison calls out to Rose, asking, "Are you killed, old boy?" "Not killed, but badly wounded," Rose replies. "Hurry forward, boys, and save yourselves if you can." Rose and his cohorts must now cover 30 miles of prairie in order to get back to the safety of their company. In a fortuitous break for the party, the Blackfoot have halted their pursuit in order to reclaim the buffalo meat that has been dropped by the trappers. Though they are now empty-handed, they are all alive. Rose, however, is beginning to rapidly decline over the course of the ride. His arm throbs in immense pain, and he is wrought with nausea and dizziness. For hours, he rides through icy winds and snow-covered grounds, his right arm dangling uselessly by his side. It is soon apparent that at least one of his wounds is the result of a poisoned bullet. As the trappers finally reach camp, it is readily apparent to all that Rose is on the verge of death. He is pulled off of his horse and carried into a tent, where Jim Bridger and a Delaware medicine man examine him. Both concur that he is the victim of a poisoned bullet, and that he has likely only survived this long due to the blood loss he has incurred during the ride. For the next few days, Rose lies in a tent, battling for his life against the effects of the poison and blood loss. His arm swells to a nearly unrecognizable mass, causing fissures in the skin at the shoulder. His nervous system becomes, in his own later words, fearfully disorganized, and even the slightest noise, light, or motion causes him great distress. His fellow trappers do all within their power to care for him, though little can be done other than keeping the wound clean and letting the man sleep as best he can. Most of his friends fear, if not outright assume, that he will not survive long. However, after about a week, the wound begins to heal. Soon, Rose is able to eat and walk, and, within a matter of only a few weeks, he is back to work, hunting and trapping. However, Rose will scarcely have regained the ability to hold down food by the time an injured scout comes riding into camp, seemingly in a full panic. The scout, a Mexican man known as Masaeno, has been shot in the ankle, though thankfully not by a poisoned bullet, and has only escaped certain death at the hands of a roving Blackfoot band by hurling himself off of a steep cliff which they were not willing to follow him down. Masaeno reports that the Blackfoot are coalescing in a winter camp on the Yellowstone River 4 miles to the south of the trappers' current location. The village is nearly 1,000 lodges strong, he says, and when they discover the trappers' location, the trappers will surely be wiped out. And so, the fight for the frontier will continue. Bridger will order his men to construct a makeshift fort, and the men to hunker down for what will be one of the most brutal encounters between native tribes and mountain men in the history of the Old West. But the accounts of that battle, as well as the countless other tales of conflict and coexistence between tribespeople and trappers, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Eastern Idaho, 1832. As bullets whiz by them and the sounds of gunshots fill the air, a group of Blackfoot warriors urge their galloping horses towards a small lake ensconced in the mountainous terrain. Behind them, in hot pursuit, ride several American fur trappers, firing their single-shot rifles and pistols to the best of their abilities while riding atop their galloping mounts. With little option in the way of escape, the small group of Blackfoot warriors take to the frigid waters of the small lake. Here, with their horses in water up to their withers, the warriors now launch arrows towards their attackers. The fur trappers in hot pursuit are momentarily stalled, not wanting to risk bogging their horses down in the water by furthering their attack. They retreat to a position on the banks of the small body of water under cover of the area's abundant timber. From here, they trade shots with the waterlogged Blackfoot, assuming their quarry to be trapped and all but assuredly doomed. But this Blackfoot hunting party the trappers have happened upon are in fact only one small part of a larger band of Blackfoot camped only a few miles away. When one warrior on a particularly fleet pony makes his way back to their village, reinforcements are quickly gathered, and in mere minutes, a force of hundreds of Blackfoot warriors are mounted and charging out of the camp towards their brethren who are trapped in the waters of the lake. Soon, it is the American fur trappers who are on the defensive, as the newly arrived Blackfoot reinforcements pour over the hilltop behind them. At the head of the attack is a Blackfoot chief named Eagle Ribs. He is a member of the Buffalo Society and among the very few warriors allowed to wear the horns of the buffalo as a headdress. He rides in front of his warriors, all among them incensed at the trappers' attack. In the preceding few months, the Blackfoot had killed numerous fur trappers in the area, along the Yellowstone and Gallatin rivers. They are, without question, the most feared tribe among the trappers here on the northern plains. The Blackfoot are a powerful warrior tribe, the ruling power here on the northern plains, a title they have earned through years of ruthless expansion after the introduction of the horse to their people sometime in the 17th century led to a veritable explosion in capabilities in both hunting and raiding. Now, as they turn the tide of the trappers' attack, a shudder flows down the spines of the once bellicose mountain men, as all among them know that, while being killed by the Blackfoot will surely be a terrifying end, it will pale in comparison to the agonies that await them should they be taken alive. Now, under a hail of arrows and bullets, the trappers are forced to retreat from their position, abandoning their attack and riding back towards their own camp several miles away. Just minutes prior to their arrival, the camp had been a typical scene of activities, with men carrying out chores, repairing equipment, and checking their inventories. But as the first riders fleeing the Blackfoot race into camp, the routine of the morning is quickly broken, and it is readily apparent to the trappers that they will now have to take immediate action in a fight for their lives. Now, the men amongst the trappers' forces will soon face the full might of the Blackfoot's martial prowess brought to bear on them here in the middle of the wilds of the Idaho mountains. Among the trappers is 28-year-old Jim Bridger, one of the most experienced among them, and for all intents and purposes, their elected leader. Bridger has seen more of the American West than most living men. Born James Felix Bridger in Richmond, Virginia in 1804, Bridger had come west like so many countless other American young men in the early 19th century, in search of adventure and fortune. As a teenage neophyte to the frontier, on his first trapping expedition, Bridger had been part of the seminal Ashley's 100 fur trapping expedition that set out from St. Louis in 1823. While on this initial foray into the world of the mountain men, Bridger had been one of the 2 men charged with remaining with Hugh Glass after his now infamous misfortune of being severely mauled by a mother grizzly in present-day South Dakota. Glass, a legendary trapper in his own right, and already a noted veteran by the time Jim Bridger arrived on the frontier, had been so badly wounded that his comrades, unable and unwilling to linger in a dangerous hostile native territory for what they saw as an exercise in futility, had left Bridger and another trapper named John Fitzgerald to remain with Glass until he inevitably expired from his wounds. But as Bridger and Fitzgerald fretfully waited hour after hour in the frigid, dangerous territory for their comrade to finally succumb to his condition, he proved amazingly and frustratingly resilient. Though he appeared to continue to decline, Glass simply refused to die. After their nerves had been sufficiently rattled by the prospect of being captured alive by hostile natives, they had weighed their options and chose, regrettably, to leave Glass to his seemingly inevitable fate. They had eventually made their way back to civilization, where the young Bridger had joined up with another fur company, and Fitzgerald had gone on to join the army. But Hugh Glass did not die. Instead, in a feat that is now etched in the annals of frontier legend, he managed to survive and effectively drag himself hundreds of miles to the nearest fort, where his wounds were treated and his life miraculously saved. Once recovered, Glass had eventually sought revenge on Bridger and Fitzgerald, but found Fitzgerald now under the protection of the U.S. Army and Bridger to be just a teenage boy. He ultimately forgave the youngster and Fitzgerald out of the charity of his own heart. Despite this relatively inauspicious start, Bridger would remain undaunted in his pursuit of life as a mountain man. In the fall of 1824, he would become one of the first white men to explore the Yellowstone region of present-day northwestern Wyoming. Here, he was one of the first Americans to lay eyes on the parting of the waters at Yellowstone Lake. In 1830, he was part of a group that bought out the legendary Jedediah Smith's stake in what would come to be known as the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a trapping outfit composed of several members of Ashley's 100 who sought to contest the powerful John Jacob Astor's monopolist American Fur Company. By 1834, however, with the decline of the beaver population and growing difficulty in turning a profit in the fur trade, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company was bought out by the American Fur Company and absorbed into Astor's corporate structure. In 1835, Bridger had married a woman named Emma from the Flathead tribe, a people who resided in the ranges of what is today western Montana and eastern Idaho. The couple would ultimately have 3 children together, necessitating, or perhaps excusing, Bridger's constant excursions with fur trapping companies into increasingly less profitable and increasingly dangerous territories. In this year of 1836, Bridger and his troop of fur trappers are on their way to the yearly rendezvous that will be held in present-day Idaho at a place called Pierre's Hole. The rendezvous is an annual tradition amongst the mountain men and local tribes, one that affords all a brief, fleeting respite from the drudgeries and dangers of life on the frontier. The furs and hides that had been so arduously gotten in the preceding year would be traded and sold. Goods and supplies would be bought and bartered for, and all could partake in the ample good food and drink. Songs, dances, gambling, gossip, as well as romantic liaisons between lonely mountain men and native women, all abounded. Though not the debauched and overtly drunken scene that is often portrayed, the yearly rendezvous was a lively and exciting affair. Bridger, as well as the rest of the mountain men in camp, had long looked forward to the affair, and now, with the rendezvous only days away, it had briefly seemed to all that they could almost taste the flowing hard cider and freshly baked breads. However, now, any thoughts of rest and recreation are quickly dashed as the influx of their comrades riding at full speed pours into the camp. The cry of "Blackfoot" quickly spreads throughout the camp, and now Jim Bridger and the rest of the trappers scramble to their single-shot rifles and make ready for the fight to come. The trappers take their positions in a loose battle line facing the direction of the approaching Blackfoot, and, for a few eerie moments, they can only hear the thundering hooves and war whoops of the warriors rapidly closing in to make their attack. Then, suddenly, the war party crests the top of the hill overlooking the campsite. Seeing the defensive line of mountain men protecting the camp, the Blackfoot pause atop the hill, just outside of rifle range. For a harrowing few minutes, a nervous tension permeates the air, as both parties warily appraise the size and strength of their opponent's forces. However, as the nervous trappers eye the sizable war party atop the hill in front of them, one amongst their party carefully and excitedly searches the lines of the mounted warriors, hoping to see a familiar face. She is the wife of one of the trappers, a Mexican man named Loretto, who had bartered for her freedom a number of years earlier after finding her as a prisoner of the Crow. She is, in fact, a member of the Blackfoot tribe. Though taken from her people as a young woman, she is intimately familiar with Blackfoot culture and customs, and, having not visited this territory for several years, might very possibly be a long-lost relative or friend to the attacking Blackfoot. While she finds no comfort in searching for a familiar face, what happens next brings a brief glimmer of hope to herself and all amongst the trappers. Calmly and coolly from atop the hill, Chief Eagle-Ribs now rides forward with a small group of warriors, bearing a pipe of peace and gesturing for the trappers to send a group of their own to discuss peace negotiations. Now, Jim Bridger enlists the help of the Blackfoot woman to act as an interpreter, and Bridger, the woman, and a small group of trappers now make their way towards the expanse between the two lines, all the while wary of a surprise attack from the Blackfoot. As an off-putting silence overtakes the battlefield, it seems to many present that all that can be heard is the plodding of the two parties' horses towards one another. As he rides in front of his group, Bridger begins to scan the line of Blackfoot warriors to the rear of Eagle-Ribs and his contingent, growing increasingly concerned as he nears the spot where the proposed negotiations are to take place. In only a precious few seconds, his suspicions overtake him, and as he, the other trappers, and the Blackfoot woman are mere yards away from Chief Eagle-Ribs and his men, with the chief now extending his hand in a gesture of peace, Bridger attempts to quietly pull back the hammer on his single-shot rifle. But in the tense silence that has befallen the would-be battlefield, the minute action resounds with a voluminous click, audible to all of those present, especially to Chief Eagle-Ribs. The Blackfoot chief instantly grabs the barrel of Bridger's rifle and thrusts it towards the ground. As he does so, Bridger attempts to pull the trigger and shoot the chief, but his bullet merely fires harmlessly into the dirt. Now, a violent struggle ensues between Bridger and Chief Eagle-Ribs, and within moments, the entirety of both parties, with the exception of the Blackfoot woman, are in a full-pitched fight. As Bridger and the chief fight from atop their horses, another Blackfoot warrior sends an arrow whipping through the air and slamming into the small of Bridger's back. Moments later, a second arrow strikes just above the first, both projectiles embedding themselves deeply into the unfortunate man's torso. With Bridger now reeling in pain, Eagle-Ribs now seizes the rifle from his hands and strikes Bridger from his horse with a powerful blow that Bridger at first assumes to have broken his neck. For her part, The Blackfoot woman takes this opportunity to flee back to the lines of the trappers and her husband and infant child. The Blackfoot warriors, however, quickly thwart her escape, cutting off her path and driving her back towards the Blackfoot. The distressed young mother now becomes irate, screaming inconsolably to be allowed to return to her child. The Blackfoot at first appear unmoved, but after recognizing her as a member of their own people, Chief Eagle-Ribs instructs the young woman to call out to her husband and ask him to bring the child to her. He assures her that her husband and child will not be harmed. Minutes later, the nervous young father plods cautiously across the veritable no-man's land that lies between the trappers' lines and the Blackfoot. He assumes that he will likely be killed as soon as he reaches the Blackfoot, but drives himself on in hopes of at least delivering the child to her mother. To his surprise, he arrives at the Blackfoot lines unharmed and is allowed to hand the child over to his wife. However, this is where the charity of Eagle-Ribs and his warriors has been exhausted. The man is instructed to now leave his wife and child and return to the trappers. He is promised that he will be left unharmed as he crosses and that his wife and child will be cared for. The unnerved trapper now makes his way, again, across the expanse of mountainous prairie, feverishly wondering if he has seen his young family for the last time. For the time being, it appears that he has, as the Blackfoot now take their newly returned tribal sister and her child with them as they sink over the hills and into the wilderness. The befuddled, heartbroken young father can only watch on. Meanwhile, though the Blackfoot have now left the battlefield, Jim Bridger's troubles have only begun, as the 2 arrows lodged deeply in his lower back now cause him excruciating pain with even the slightest movement. As his blood-soaked shirt is cut away, it is apparent to his attending brethren that extracting the arrows will be a difficult, painful process. While one of the arrows is pried free with relative ease, the second remains lodged immovably. The arrows employed by this band of Blackfoot are steel-tipped, acquired from trade with the British. Unlike their stone predecessors, these tips do not break or shatter, but bend and hook upon impact, making the extraction of a warped arrowhead all but impossible. After several excruciating attempts, the decision is made that the arrowhead will have to be left. The mountain men present, acting as rudimentary though serviceable physicians considering the circumstances, agree that any further surgical incursion into the wound by their untrained hands will only cause more damage. And so, the bent steel arrowhead is left where it has struck, embedded in the soft tissue of Jim Bridger's lower back. In this pitiable condition, Bridger is now forced to endure the agonizing ride to the rendezvous. The long-awaited trip is all but spoiled for the young mountain man, as his pride is also significantly wounded, having suffered not only the arrow wounds, but the theft of his rifle by the Blackfoot chief Eagle-Ribs. Though Bridger is able to turn a substantial profit for his year's worth of trapping, the limitations of his condition only serve to dampen his spirits. But this will not be the last time that the legendary Jim Bridger will meet with the feared and fearsome Blackfoot. Though he will carry the arrowhead in his back for the remainder of his life, Bridger will return to the frontier in only a matter of weeks, and over the course of the succeeding years, he and his trapper cohorts will meet the Blackfoot in countless brutal confrontations in the fight to control the northern plains. But the many stories of the fabled life of Jim Bridger, as well as the countless instances of heroism, ferocity, selflessness, and tragedy that will occur in the battles between the mountain men and the Blackfoot in the years to come, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Montana, May 1810. At their campsite on the shores of the Jefferson River, a small group of fur trappers ready themselves for another long day's work of setting and checking their traps. These men are among the first to venture into this territory, a land whose unrivaled beauty is constantly at odds with the very real and very mortal threat of hostile tribes. The trappers' shared goal is to acquire their own personal fortunes by trapping the seemingly endless supply of beaver and selling the pelts to hat manufacturers back east. The mountain men are traders and trappers, not settlers, and they are not necessarily seen as intruders by all of the tribes. In fact, many have deep ties to the native peoples, often being adopted or marrying into the tribes, and several of the fur trappers in this group hail from mixed-race families, and they are not at all considered unusual. And perhaps none among this crew of fur trappers is as representative of the meeting and mixing of cultures as 36-year-old George Druillard. Born in 1773 in old Sandwich town, Windsor, Ontario, to a French-Canadian father and a Shawnee mother, Druillard has grown up on the frontier, learning the skills required of any good woodsman, from tracking to hunting and fishing to map-making. However, since his father was a commissioned officer in the military, the young man also learned to read, write, and speak both French and English, as well as a number of native dialects, including Shawnee and Iroquois. He is also fluent in the common sign language ubiquitous here amongst most tribes of the northern plains, and this makes him a valuable man. In 1803, he was recruited by Meriwether Lewis for what would become the legendary Voyage of Discovery, in which the party of Lewis and Clark made the first incursion into the high plains, then the Rockies, and ultimately to the Pacific coast and back. Druillard had solidified his place in frontier lore with his participation in this expedition, and now he is viewed by many of the younger trappers with a sense of awe. He claims that, being as he is half native, he is as at home in the wilderness as any native in the territory, and thus is in fact quite safe roaming about freely, anywhere that he pleases. However, even the rawest rookie trappers among them assume that Druillard means this, at least in part, as a joke. For all among them are painfully, palpably aware that they are still intruding on lands that they are not welcome in. Their mere presence here, uninvited and without permission, means that they are all subject to the dangers that this entails, including violent ends at the hands of tribes like the Cheyenne, the Arikara, and, most prevalent in this area, the mighty Blackfoot. The Blackfoot have long dominated here on the northern plains. They are a warrior society whose very existence hinges on their possession of the best available hunting grounds. For well over a century now, they have proven nearly universally combative to all trespassers, and there's no reason to think that they have changed their tact. However, these dangers have been assumed by all in the party before they had even moved their expedition out from St. Louis in the first place. On that brisk morning, as the men gnawed down quick, cold breakfasts of beef jerky and pemmican, they had all decided that the danger of life as a trapper was, in the end, worth the risk. Because though there is plenty of danger to be had out here on the frontier, there is also plenty of money to be made. But the assumed risk of their job does not mean that they are foolhardy men. Every morning begins with the men getting approval for their proposed territory from the officer in charge, and then checking out the necessary gear from their quartermaster, all of which has to be meticulously recorded and later scoured over by accountants from the fur companies that they work for. The day usually begins before dawn, with the men departing camps in groups of 4. Each group then works their way up and down the tributaries of whatever major river that they are on, with 2 of them setting traps and the other 2 keeping a watch out for hostile native warriors. In general, this system does seem to provide enough security to keep the vast majority of the trappers alive. However, it does not often make them wealthy. This meticulous approach means that the profit from every pelt has to be split 4 ways, in addition to the fur companies taking their share. Thus, while their physical security is most assuredly greatly appreciated, many find the practice financially draining and more than a little frustrating. Among the most disgruntled of the men is George Druillard. With all of his knowledge and experience, and what he believes to be the inherent invincibility provided by his bloodline, Druillard believes this diligent practice is not only unnecessary, but an affront to his personal honor. Druillard objects so strongly, in fact, that he has begun to operate in open defiance of the company's policies. For several days prior to this, he had simply finished his breakfast, mounted his horse, and deftly slipped off over the hills, alone but for his single-shot rifle, his pistol, and his tomahawk. To the rest of the fur trappers, the luster of his reputation has now worn thin. He now seems to be a man lost in his own legend and bent on inviting his own destruction. The more experienced among them who have been so unlucky as to find the mutilated bodies of their comrades believe Druillard has gone insane. Again and again, the veterans among them have beseeched Druillard, as he headed out for the day, not to go out alone. But, much to their dismay, Druillard has repeatedly not only gone out alone, but returned each day with a sizable harvest of beaver. And, because Druillard has gotten these pelts on his own, he will be entitled to all of the profits that they will draw. Other than the fur company's cut, Druillard will be pocketing all of the profit from each pelt, as opposed to the 25% that the rest of his cohorts are used to. In very short order, Druillard has decided that giving up this level of profit increase for a measure of security is at once a wholly unacceptable proposition. And so, on this day, as his cohorts begin to make their way up and downstream to begin their day's labor, George Druillard again bids them a jovial farewell and heads off over the hills alone. The day passes by like any other, with some men finding their traps full and others returning to camp empty-handed. But that evening, as the men sit around their small campfire, a pensive mood begins to hang in the air. As each four-man group makes their way back into camp, word goes around that something has gone wrong. No one has seen or heard from George Druillard all day. But nothing can be done in the dead of night, and so the men sleep as best they can before waking to another chilly riverside morning, still with no Druillard in sight. Growing more and more nervous, the men discuss how they might find and help the vaunted mountain man. In short order, a search party is sent out to comb the surrounding area, and it is only a matter of hours before the search party returns, eyes wide, faces somber, and with horrifying news to report. They have indeed found George Druillard. He had been caught alone near a small creek by a group of Blackfoot. How many, they cannot be sure, but from the number of arrows left at the scene, they assumed that there were several. To the best of the rescue party's estimation, Druillard had mounted his horse and ridden in small, feverish circles, firing off his rifle and then his pistol as he whirled. He had fought with his knife and tomahawk, and from the amount of blood on the egress trail of the Blackfoot, he had grievously wounded at least a few of them. However, his horse was ultimately shot, and Druillard was brought to the ground and drilled with arrows and lances. One can only imagine his regret after having been so assured of his safety. Once he was dead, or perhaps as he died, as was often the case in plains warfare, Druillard was eviscerated. He then had his hands and feet cut off and was ultimately beheaded. His head was never found. Terrified at both the ghastly sight before them and the very real prospect of the same thing happening to them, the search party hurriedly buried the frontiersman in a shallow grave before making their way back to camp. The death of George Druillard is a pivotal point in the history of the American mountain man. It illustrated that even the most experienced and venerable amongst them were as vulnerable to the hand of fate as any man. From here on out, few mountain men would ever venture out alone again. But though the story of George Druillard does end here, the story of the mountain men and the tribes that they interacted with, both peaceably and otherwise, is replete with countless stories such as this one. However, for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Montana, 1834. In the middle of the night, a camp of fur trappers and native guides bustles with activity. Under the flicker of their campfire's light, the native Delaware warriors who serve as scouts for the trappers daub red and black war paint on their faces in intentionally frightening patterns. Under the same light, their cohorts in the mountain men, who make up the majority of this trapping party, clean their rifles and check their supplies. Though this group of men is not a military outfit, all among them are preparing for battle. The Blackfoot, the reigning and rightful rulers of this territory, have killed one of the trappers' own, a beloved man known only to posterity as Mr. Howell. The evening prior, Howell had been out checking traps with another member of the party when they had been attacked by the Blackfoot. While his companion had escaped, Howell had been mortally wounded and suffered an ugly, agonizing demise in plain view of all of his friends and comrades. Now, the blood of the trappers and native scouts runs hot for vengeance. As the Delaware scouts carry out their ritual war dance, the mountain men confer with each other in hushed, angry tones about the revenge they intend to exact upon the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot, so named by the traders from the Hudson Bay Company, who noticed that, after trekking eastward to the Great Bay over grasslands that had been recently scorched by wildfires, the tribal members' deerskin leggings and moccasins were stained black with prairie soot, had long been the primary adversary in this area for not only the trappers, but many of their weaker neighbors who often bore the brunt of Blackfoot raiding and warfare. In this austere, unforgiving landscape, the Blackfoot have staked their claim, and it is well known amongst all that trespassers of any kind are not tolerated on their lands. But, however serious the consequences, the tide of fur trappers making their way north along the many rivers and tributaries that crisscross the country had been steadily increasing over the decade. Though their initial dealings with the Lewis and Clark expedition had indeed been largely peaceful, the continued incursion of trappers had been met with a consistent stream of hostilities from the mighty Blackfoot. While trappers often traveled in parties numbering in the dozens, nearly all of whom would be heavily armed, the litany list of trappers and mountain men who had lost their lives for trespassing was ever growing and well known amongst all those who ventured out on the wild expanses of the northern plains. Every man amongst the trapping party, now readying themselves for combat, had known this danger, as had their dead comrade Howell. But this does little to whet the trappers' and native scouts' appetite for vengeance in the name of their comrade. Although they are largely a motley crew of what most in the large cities back east would consider unfit for civilized society, they are not without leadership nor order. But in this harsh world, where decisions made in seconds can have consequences that spell life or certain death, allegiance and obedience are not offered in deference to office or pedigree. Here, a man's reputation and skills make him worthy of leadership, and few men on the whole of the frontier are more skilled, experienced, or well-known than the man who now leads this party of men bent on revenge. He is a tall, well-built, rangy-limbed man with a penchant for jokes and good humor, paired with an uncanny knack for survival and a hellacious bent for combat. His name is Jim Bridger. At this time in 1836, he is 32 years old, but he is already a longtime veteran of the frontier and a legend amongst his fellow mountain men. Born James Felix Bridger on March 17, 1804, in Richmond, Virginia, Bridger had been orphaned at the age of 13 and made his way to St. Louis to work as an apprentice for a newspaper printer. However, after reading one of the paper's advertisements posted by General William Henry Ashley calling for, quote, 100 men to ascend the river Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. The 18-year-old Bridger had joined up, along with several other men, such as Thomas Fitzpatrick, William Sublett, Davy Jackson, James Clyman, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith, all of whom would go on to become legendary mountain men in their own right. The group would go on to be known as Ashley's 100, and in the ensuing decade and a half since that advertisement's publication, Bridger and his cohorts had gone on to explore vast expanses of the American frontier that had only yet been seen by its native peoples. During this time, Bridger had survived countless clashes and run-ins with a number of tribes on the American plains. But it was the Blackfoot whom he feared most, and who most drew his quenchless ire. Now, as he makes his final preparations and mounts his horse, Bridger is silent amidst the cyclone of activity that surrounds him. There is no need nor tolerance for rousing speeches nor exhortations amongst this crowd, as Bridger well knows, and thus his instructions are terse. The Blackfoot are nearby. They are to catch them off guard and kill as many warriors as possible until they are able to drive the Blackfoot out of this vicinity. Then, and only then, will their vengeance be complete. Silently, the party now moves out, with their Delaware scouts leading the way. However skilled and reputable any of the mountain men may be, their skills in tracking are largely incomparable to their native guides who had been schooled in its practice since childhood. Now, under cover of the night, the mean-eyed and tight-lipped contingent makes its way across the sparse landscape, myopically intent on exacting their proverbial pound of flesh from their hated rivals. As the chill of the night winds envelop them, the men do their best to steady their nerves and temper their anger, lest a tactical mistake be made in this critical hour. Finally, the Blackfoot camp is in sight, but the Blackfoot sentries have alerted their comrades, and the Blackfoot are now securely ensconced in a grove of cottonwood and willow trees on the bank of a small river which runs behind them. Just before coming into rifle range of the Blackfoot, the contingent of trappers and scouts comes to a halt. Bridger and the other trappers huddle to discuss their next course of action against this unexpectedly entrenched enemy position. However, as the mountain men confer, the Delaware scouts see no need for what they believe to be baseless precautions. The Delaware, with tomahawk in one hand and rifle in the other, make an immediate headlong charge towards the Blackfoot position. They swarm into the thicket holding the Blackfoot with such ferocity that the Blackfoot are compelled to retreat, thinking that a far larger force has fallen upon them. As the Delaware hack and shoot down any Blackfoot that they can, the remainder of the Blackfoot force quickly swims midway across the river to a small island. From their positions, the still bewildered trappers can see the Blackfoot swimming across the river, holding their rifles above their heads so as not to waterlog them. Now, this band of warrior kings on the northern plains are, pitiably, trapped on an island with little cover and little possibility for escape. The trappers and Delaware scouts now take their time and ease into firing positions least exposed to the warriors on the island. The mood has now changed from one of uncertain foreboding to a level of conviviality often reserved for picnics and parties. The following account from fur trapper and participant in the battle, Isaac P. Rose, describes the scene as follows in his memoir, 4 Years in the Rockies. It may appear strange to our readers, yet it is nevertheless true that the feeling experienced by the trappers when about to make a raid on a band of hostile Indians resembles those of our country friends when going to visit a circus. It is relaxation from their usual employment, and a good time for fun, frolic, and adventure is expected. Every trapper had selected a tree or clump of bushes within fair rifle range of their enemies, and whenever a Blackfoot exposed any part of his person, a ball from one of the trapper's rifles would send the unfortunate native back to the happy hunting grounds. This fight may be considered regular target practice. One of the Indians would hoist a breechcloth above the logs, and in 1 minute it would be cut down by a bullet from one of the white men's rifles, followed by shouts and yells from the trapper who witnessed the shot. And, again, a trapper would place his wolfskin cap on his ramrod and raise it above his place of concealment, and it would soon be perforated by an Indian bullet. In this way the fight went on for several hours, but with little advantage to either party. Despite the mortal consequences, the mood is light, even when one of the trapper's own suffers a minor injury. A man named Mark Heed manages to incur a scrape on his upper arm from a bullet. The man, well known amongst his fellow trappers for his distinct, nasally drawl, cries out in shock and pain, "I've been shot!" The trappers further down the firing line from him cannot make out his words, and ask those in between themselves and heed what the man has said. "He says he shot an Indian," yells one. The indignant tone of Heed himself then cuts through, correcting, "No, I didn't either. I said I was shot myself." The trappers instantaneously fall into an uproarious laughter, realizing that the wound is not serious and that their friend is not injured enough to encumber his personality. However, for the Blackfoot and for the Delaware scouts, there is no laughter to be had. The animus between the two tribes has run long and deep over decades of conflict, and the Delaware are intent on taking the fight to their hated enemy. As the firing carries on further down the line, a lone Delaware warrior swims his horse across the river to the foot of the island inhabited by the Blackfoot. From here, he creeps to within 50 yards of the Blackfoot position, as they remain preoccupied with firing upon the trappers across the river. The Delaware warrior, in an astonishing display of reckless vainglory, quickly climbs a cottonwood tree and takes up a position overlooking the Blackfoot. From here, he begins to pepper them with accurate sniper fire, dispatching 3 Blackfoot warriors in 3 successive shots. However, after the third warrior falls, the Blackfoot are able to ascertain the Delaware's position. Now, bark and tree limbs explode all around the Delaware warrior as he climbs down and retreats back to the foot of the island, swimming his horse back across the river to the renown and praise of his comrades. For hours more, through the afternoon and into the early evening, the fight drags on, with intermittent shots being taken, but no significant damage being done to either party. Finally, both sides are forced to make camp and break for the night, as darkness renders their targets indiscernible. The trappers and Delaware scouts make camp near the river, and rise early the next morning, intent on resuming their fight with the Blackfoot. However, upon cresting the ridge that separates their camp from the previous day's firing line, the trappers and scouts find the island deserted, the Blackfoot having absconded onto the prairie in the night. For now, life can return to the trappers' normal routine of trekking up and down streams, setting and checking traps, and completing camp chores. Jim Bridger will go on to lead this contingent to a successful haul this season, earning a worthy profit for each of the men in his charge. However, this fight with the Blackfoot will be but one of only the initial forays into combat with the mighty warrior tribe that the trappers will experience during this trapping season, before making their way to the yearly rendezvous in Wyoming to sell their furs. Though they have no intentions of settling upon this land, they are still trespassers, ones who the Blackfoot will offer no quarter to, so long as they traverse their territories. But the many tales of fights and ferocities between the mountain men, their native allies, and the Blackfoot are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Chapter 28. The Rendezvous. Arrival of Grand Visitors, Trip to Wind River, and a fight with the Blackfeet. The season now being far advanced and time for the rendezvous nearly at hand, Jim Bridger and his company left Jackson's Hole and commenced moving toward Green River, trapping as they went. It was during this trip that Rose met with a rather curious adventure and had what might be called a very narrow escape. The ground over which they had been traveling for some days was so stony or gravelly, it was hard on the horses' feet. In fact, some of them became so sore that they could hardly travel, and the trappers were compelled to make moccasins for them out of rawhide. Rose, wishing to make up for lost time, determined to try his luck on a small stream, in which beaver were said to be plenty. But the spot was known to be infested by Blackfeet, and few of the trappers felt inclined to venture out in that direction. As the horse belonging to Rose was too lame to travel, he started an old mule belonging to the company, and Rose says it was one of the most stubborn brutes he ever saw. No amount of coaxing, whipping, or spurring would induce it to get out of a walk. In fact, when he felt the spur touch his flanks, he would stop at once and commence biting at the rider's feet. But as the mule's hooves were sound, Rose concluded that anything would be better than walking. He felt convinced, however, that if chased by the Blackfeet, he should be compelled to leave the mule and trust his own legs for safety. About 5 miles from camp, he shot a deer, and, taking from it the fat ribs, he cooked enough to do him for a day or two, taking the balance along in case he should need it. A little after nightfall, he reached his destination, and as beaver signs were good, he at once set up his traps. He hung his venison on a bush, tethered his mule, and rolled himself into blankets, then laid down in the bushes and went to sleep. How long he slept, he didn't know. He was suddenly awakened by the snorting of the mule, and, springing to his feet, rifle in hand, he saw a large grizzly bear walking off with his venison. Cocking his rifle, he was about to fire, when Caleb, the trapper's colloquial name for the grizzly bear, disappeared into the bushes. It being too dark to follow the monster, Rose again laid down, and slept until near daylight. Then, taking up his traps, he discovered he had caught 4 good beaver. While engaged in skinning them, he fancied he smelt smoke and a fire, and, hurrying up the skinning process, he packed his traps and, mounting his mule, rode out of the bushes to a small hill close by. From the top of this, he was horrified to perceive a camp of nearly 200 Blackfeet Indians, not more than 200 yards above him on the stream. It being still dark, Rose had not been seen, and he immediately started for camp, expecting to hear the howls of warriors on his trail. On reaching a hill near his own camp, he saw 2 Indians lying flat on the ground, reconnoitering. Rose felt certain he could kill one of them, but then what was to prevent the other from killing him? Just as he was considering what was best to be done, the Indians caught sight of him, and, springing to their feet, ran off at full speed, and Rose rode into camp with his old mule and beaver skins, thinking that he had made a very narrow escape. The rendezvous of 1837 was a very grand affair, and the new supply of stores was very much needed. The company had done a great deal of trading during the year, and their stock of goods had been nearly exhausted for some time. In fact, the trappers had not been in as bad a fix since their trip to the Humboldt River. Their blankets were worn out, and their ammunition was getting low. And Jim Bridger, legendary mountain man, began to get scared, as an encounter with the Blackfeet, under these circumstances, would have been dangerous. But the caravan from St. Louis made its appearance at about the usual time, and laughter, fun, and frolic were, once more, the order of the day. Several visitors came out with the train from St. Louis this year. Mr. Gray, the missionary, returned to the mountains, bringing with him his wife and 4 other ladies, all bound for the mission on the Columbia River. An English nobleman, known as Sir William Stewart, called by the trappers Captain Stewart, also came out with the train, bringing with him a retinue of servants and a number of splendid horses. This was Captain Stewart's second trip to the mountains, he having been delighted with his first visit. He brought with him lots of stores and regaled the whole of the trappers with a grand entertainment. He also made them some very valuable presents, giving Bridger, Kit Carson, and Joe Meek, with whom he had become acquainted on his first visit, each a valuable horse, and to many of the other trappers he also gave costly presents. It was at this entertainment that Rose partook of some water and crackers, this being the first thing of the kind he had eaten since his stay in the mountains, and the boys all thought it a great delicacy. The Delaware and Shawnee Indians came in large numbers to trade, and that summer Jim Bridger sent over 100 packs of beaver skins to St. Louis, together with a large quantity of buffalo robes and grizzly pelts. There was the usual amount of drinking, carousing, and horse racing, and altogether the rendezvous of this year presented a remarkably lively appearance. When the rendezvous was pretty well over, and the time for fall trapping was drawing near, Bridger called in Rose and Carson for the purpose of holding a powwow as to the route it would be best to take for the fall hunt. Rose was in favor of the Wind River, as beaver were known to be plentiful in all of the streams that took their rise in the Wind River Mountains. But to reach this desirable location, it would be necessary to pass through the heart of Blackfeet country, and, in all probability, they would have to do some tall fighting. But, as the idea of a fight with the Blackfoot was not likely to prove an objection to their taking that route, that, in fact, to many of the trappers it would be an inducement, it was agreed by Bridger and his partners that the Wind River should be the scene of operations for the first part of the fall hunt. All things now in readiness, Bridger and his company started for the Wind River Mountains, and nothing of interest occurred for the first 2 or 3 days. On the 4th day, however, Rose, Meek, and about 30 or 40 of the other trappers set out to travel up the river to the headwaters, accompanied by the famous Indian painter Stanley, whose party was met with, this fall, traveling among the mountains. The party of trappers were a day or two ahead of the main camp when they found themselves following close after a big Blackfeet village, which had recently passed over the trail, as could be seen by the usual signs, also by the dead bodies strewn along the trail, victims to that horrible scourge, smallpox. The village was evidently fleeing to the mountains, hoping to rid itself of the plague in their colder and more salubrious air. Not long after coming to these evidences of proximity to an enemy, a party of 150 of their warriors were discovered encamped in a defile or narrow bottom enclosed by high bluffs through which the trappers would have to pass. Seeing that in order to pass the war party and the village, which was about half a mile in advance, there would be some fighting to be done, the trappers resolved to begin the battle at once by attacking their enemies, who were as yet ignorant of their presence in the neighborhood. In pursuance of this determination, Rose, Meek, and a number of other trappers commenced hostilities. Leaving their horses in camp, they crawled along the edge of the overhanging bluff until opposite of the encampment of Blackfeet, then fired on them from the shelter of some bushes which grew along the rocks. But the Blackfeet, though ignorant of the number of enemies, were not to be dislodged so easily, and, after an hour or two of random shooting, contrived to scale the bluffs at a point higher up and to get upon a ridge of ground still higher than that occupied by the trappers. This movement dislodged the latter, and they hastily retreated through the bushes and returned to camp. The next day, the main camp having come up, the fight was renewed. While the greater body of the company with the pack horses were passing along the high bluffs overhanging them, the party of the day before, and 40 or 50 others, undertook to drive the Indians from the bottom, and by keeping them engaged, allow the train to pass in safely. This they contrived to do, and, after some heavy skirmishing, the Indians were compelled to retreat to their village, and Bridger and his company continued to the Wind River without meeting any further adventure. Chapter 29. The Fall Hunt. Ammunition runs short. Rose volunteers to go to Fort Laramie. Rose's adventures with the Gros Ventre, and his safe return. The fall hunt did not prove as successful as anticipated. Though beaver were plentiful on the Wind River, the company were continually annoyed by prowling bands of Blackfeet, who were hovering around the camp in hopes of cutting off some straggling trapper or stampeding and stealing some of the horses. This annoyance interfered considerably with the trappers' business, as they were compelled to hunt in strong squads. Even then, they would often lose some of their traps. This was not at all a healthy situation for the trappers to be placed in, but it was still more unhealthy for the Blackfeet, several of whom were caught sneaking around the camp and sent to the happy hunting grounds by the deadly rifle fire of the trappers. To add to their misfortune and annoyance, it was found that their ammunition was running short, and it would be impossible for them to continue on unless a fresh supply could be obtained from some quarter. In fact, Bridger began to get very uneasy, and towards the latter end of October, he sent Tom Briggs with 10 men and some pack horses to Fort Laramie to procure the needed supplies, and with strict orders to return with them at once before winter set in. But, unfortunately, cold and stormy weather came on early that winter, and before the middle of November, the company proceeded to their winter headquarters on the Yellowstone. By the latter end of November, the winter appeared to be set in earnest. There were continual and heavy storms, and all the streams in that region were frozen over. A small party of the trappers got lost and had been given up for some time, as it would be impossible for horses to travel through the snow, and Bridger began to be very much alarmed at the safety of the company. Several consultations were held as to what was best to be done under the circumstances. Bridger thought the lost trappers had been gobbled up by the Indians, or they would most assuredly have been back before winter set in. At length, Rose volunteered to go to Fort Laramie if one of the other trappers would accompany him, but this, at first, none of them seemed inclined to do. But after 2 days' consideration, a trapper by the name of David Woods volunteered to go, and it was agreed that Rose and Woods should start the next morning. The accoutrements of their journey consisted, besides their rifles and ammunition, of a buffalo robe and a blanket for each, and a pair of snowshoes. Thus equipped, and provided with 2 days' ration of buffalo meat, they started on a perilous journey of 300 miles, through a wild and mountainous country covered with snow, which in some places was 50 or 60 feet deep, and knowing that at any time they were likely to fall in with a savage grizzly or the still more dangerous Blackfeet. With a farewell cheer from their comrades, and with, quote, health that mocks the doctor's rules, and knowledge never learned in schools, they commenced their first day's journey to Fort Laramie. The first night, they thought they had accomplished about 25 miles of their journey, and they camped near a small stream. They scooped a hole in the snow, and breaking off some pine bushes for a bed, they rolled themselves in their blankets and buffalo robes and slept soundly till morning. They found, however, that the travel of the day before had strained their insteps to such a degree that they could scarcely walk, and it was only after a great deal of rubbing that they were able to travel with their snowshoes. The second day, they did not make more than 10 miles before their feet gave out completely. They had reached the banks of a small river, comparatively free of snow, and had seated themselves on a log to rest, when a couple of deer came trotting down on the other side of the stream. Rose immediately took his rifle from its pouch and shot one of them. Then, gathering a lot of dry limbs, they built a fire and feasted sumptuously on the venison steak. Then, replenishing their fire, they laid down between it and the log they had set on, and slept comfortably until morning. In the morning, finding their insteps were too sore to travel, they rested another day. The next morning, being thoroughly rested, Rose proposed that they should put up some soft buffalo skin between the strap of the snowshoe and their insteps. This they found acted like a charm, and from that time forward they had no more trouble with their snowshoes. After about 2 weeks they struck the Sweetwater, and a few days after reached the North Platte, and, to their great joy, landed at Fort Laramie 2 days before Christmas. Here they found the lost party of trappers, who had arrived at the fort in safety, but, owing to the winter having set in so early, they were afraid to attempt to rejoin their company. Rose and his comrade, Woods, were hospitably received and entertained, and they were glad to get a few days of rest after their long and perilous journey. Christmas was celebrated at the fort in the usual manner. A cannon that was mounted in the bastion was heavily loaded to be shot off as a grand Christmas gun. In order to make a louder report, an old pair of buckskin pants and several pairs of old moccasins were rammed in till the gun was filled nearly to the muzzle. The gunner refused to touch the cannon off, as he said there was sure to be a burst. Dave Crow, one of the crappers and a particular friend of Rose's, took the iron rod from the fire and touched it off, and, as the gunner predicted, it flew into 100 pieces. One of the splinters broke Crow's leg. One of the men at the fort pretended to know all about dressing the wound, and Rose left his friend in his care. Rose was compelled to go up the Chugwater River with his horses, as the pasture was getting very poor around the fort. During his absence, his friend Crow died, the man caring for him having bandaged his legs so tightly that mortification set in. The trappers had a jolly time at the fort during winter. Rose says it was the most pleasant winter he spent during his stay in the mountains. While Rose was at the fort, Masalino, a Mexican trapper and scout who had been up at the Chugwater River, came in, bringing with him a vial that contained about an ounce of gold dust. The trappers, at first, laughed at the idea of its being gold, but the Mexican assured them that this was the pure stuff and added that his father and himself had worked in a gold mine for years. When the spring set in, Rose and several other trappers started to join Jim Bridger's company, having with them about 15 pack horses and mules loaded with goods and supplies. They journeyed about a week without meeting any adventure worth relating, when one day, about noon, having ascended up a steep ridge, they came upon a band of about 50 Gros Ventre Indians. These Indians are not as fierce as the Blackfeet, but are very imprudent and overbearing when they think they have the upper hand. The Gros Ventres halted about 150 yards from the trappers, and the chief came forward to hold a powwow. And one of the trappers leading the party went out to meet him. The chief assumed a very dictatorial tone. He said his band was poor and needed supplies, and that if the white man would give up their horses and mules with their packs, he would allow the trappers to go on their way unharmed. If not, they must take the consequences. The trapper said he would return to his company and consult with his men. This he did, looking pretty badly scared. He told the trappers that he thought it was the best thing they could do, and that perhaps giving up their horses and goods would be the only chance to save their lives. This speech made Rose very angry. He represented to the other trappers that he and his comrade Wood had traveled 300 miles in the depth of winter to secure the much-needed supplies for their company, and that the very existence of the American Fur Company who employed them depended on these supplies reaching them. He pointed out that the Gros Ventres were not much more than 3 to 1, that they were very poorly armed, not having more than a dozen rifles among them, the balance of their arms being bows and arrows and spears, that he would make peaceable terms with them if possible, but that he would fight as long as he had a bullet in his pouch before they should take a single horse or pack. Most of the trappers coincided with the views expressed by Rose, and the chief again came out, accompanied by a half-breed as his interpreter, and Rose and Masalino were appointed to meet with them and state their case. Rose told the chief that the white men had always been friendly to the Gros Ventres, and that they were willing and remained so, and that they were willing to make him some handsome presents. He stated that they were well armed, and before they would give up a single horse or pack, they would fight to the death. And, not to be beaten in bombast, Rose informed the chief that they had often whooped bands of Blackfeet when the odds were much greater against them. This speech acted like magic, and the chief and his interpreter returned to his band, quite crestfallen. Rose and his party then took the packs from the mules, and the barrels of 15 rifles were pointed at the Indians, who, seeing the white men determined, accepted a few butcher knives and a couple of red blankets, and the trappers went on their way. In a few days, they arrived at the Rosebud, where they met with Jim Bridger and his company. The delight on receiving the long-looked-for supplies can be better imagined than described.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. And be sure to follow us on TikTok, on Instagram, and also subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.